Alright guys, now we are going to build the computer with all those parts that I just unboxed. Now, you can start really any way you want to, but I generally start by putting the power supply in first. Alright, so, with the power supply, it's very simple and easy. You have 4 screws to put in. The one right here is off from the corner and lines up with the holes for it on the case. Now, thankfully, the people at Thermaltake, and most power supply manufacturers for that matter, give you the screws needed to screw in your power supply. So once you've lined it up, it's pretty easy to just screw in. Computers are not hard to build. They may be intimidating, but they are not difficult. Now, some people like to use power screwdrivers, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I prefer to hand tighten mine. It's not like I have to build 1,000 of these very quickly. Now, the next thing I like to do is put in the motherboard. Before you can put in the motherboard, you should install the processor, as well as put in the backplate. It's not something you actually have to do, but it's pretty smart to do it. So the audio ports go on the bottom. You just line it up and push back until it pops into place. And there you go. Now, here's the motherboard. What we are going to do is there's a little latch right here next to the processor, and we are going to push that down, pull it out, lift it up, and that is the processor cover that we can take off. Now, the processor is very easy to install, but you do want to be careful. You do not want to touch any of the contacts on the bottom of the chip. Yeah, it's probably not the end of the world if you do, but it's wise to try to avoid it. So once you open it, you grab it by the sides, and you'll notice there's a notch on either side of the top of the chip. And likewise, there are 2 notched out pieces of plastic to line up with. So you just line it up as best you can, and then once you've done that, you drop in the processor. You make sure that don't apply too much pressure to it. You don't want to bend any pins, but make sure it's lined up. You close the little top part, you pull down the latch, and lock it into place. There, your processor has been installed. Next, you have to install the heatsink. I prefer to undo that particular piece. You want to make sure that there's plenty of room with the wires so that the fan does not hit it. I then plug in the fan to the CPU header on the board for power. I then line up the 4 legs with the holes. I put my thumbs lightly on this and lift up the board. I make sure that the legs are sticking through the holes, and then you just simply push down until you hear a click on each of the legs. And there you go. Your heatsink has been installed. Now, you can move these wires out of the way or tuck them into place depending on what you've got going on, or zip tie them, which I personally disagree with, because should you ever have to replace it, you decide to go to liquid cooling, whatever, you then have to cut the zip ties, and that's obnoxious. Now, the next part you don't have to do right away, but I like to do it before I install the board, is to install the RAM chips. There's a notch on the RAM chip. One side is larger than the other, and you just match them up. Now, usually, you are going to have 4 slots, 2 different colors for the slots. And what's going to happen here is if you put the 2 chips, arguably you'll have 2 chips, hopefully you'll have 2 chips. If you put 2 chips in the same color slot, you will have, I'm drawing a blank, dual channel RAM. And that's going to be faster than putting the RAM chips, say, next to each other in 2 different colored slots. There you go. Now, when installing the motherboard, you have these little standoffs on the inside. And they are so that the back part of your motherboard doesn't press up against the metal case. That would be bad. For any of you who have ever thought about doing that, or done it on accident, bad. So these standoffs are these little pieces right here. Now, each motherboard, depending on the size you got, will have a different set of configuration. Sometimes you might want to hold the board to it, pull it away, see where the standoffs are, and make sure that they're all where they need to be. In this case, I know I need to put in 2 spots, so I'm going to go here and put in that standoff. You just screw them in, and here. Make sure they're nice and tight, but don't over tighten them to the point that you strip them and make them worthless. Now, for the next part, what I prefer to do is get your screwdriver ready with one of the screws. Magnetic tips are fine. So you put the board in, you line it up to the back plate, you make sure all the parts that need to go through, any of the back spots go through, you make sure the holes line up, and then you screw in through one of the holes on the board. I like to start with the top left. I don't tighten it down as much as I can, and then I go for the spot in the bottom right, and I try to make sure that the board is still lined up. And now I will tighten it till it is actually tight. Go back up, tighten the other one. Now that we know the board is lined up, I'm going to go for the top right. And the bottom left. I like to do it on the opposite sides. Not that it really matters with this kind of thing, but it helps prevent any kind of warping the board, things like that, in case you have not mounted it properly. Then I go for the more or less middle left to the middle right, and then for the last slot right under the RAM chips. In this case, there is actually no standoff slot for that last one that I was talking about. So we'll just go for the one right under the RAM chips. Ta-da! Your motherboard has been installed. At this point, you can go ahead and install the rest of the parts as you see fit. My personal recommendation is doing the video card last so you can get cables in, out, and around as you need without having it in the way. But you can do it any way you like. So I am going to unwrap theoretically unwrap these front panel cables. Oh, come on. There we go. Alright. So, for the USB 3 in the front, you'll plug that into one of those USB 3 headers. There is a notch to line up. So you plug that into either port. They're both created equally. You'll snap it into place, and voila, you're done. Now, in your motherboard manual, it'll show you how to plug in these ports, or these cables, for the power switch, reset switch, hard drive light, and power light. I already know how they go, so I am going to do that now. This will be different for just about every motherboard you have. They all do it similarly. I've noticed that Asus and Gigabyte like to do it their way. I miss Intel motherboards, but you know, hey. Alright, so we've got that plugged in. Now, in this case, we have a 1394 FireWire cable that I will not be plugging in. So I'm going to tuck that in the back there. And the front panel audio. Because this particular board does not have FireWire. I have no need for FireWire, I just like everything else about the case, which is why I got it. Now, in the case of solid states, when you go to install the drive, there are 4 holes that you can line up to the solid state, and this is how you can mount your solid state, and then slide it right in. No need for extra mounting brackets or anything like that. You line it up, and you screw it in. Very simple. See, nothing about this has actually been difficult. You slide that in, and you're good to go. Now I'm going to take off the other side panel, so we can start routing our cables and getting everything done. Now, because of the size of this motherboard, there's an actual gap right here that isn't necessarily going to be there if you get a larger size board. Okay, it won't be there at all. Now, you can choose to do things this way or not. In this particular case, however, what I like to do, you go and you route the power cable through the back. And I will actually be coming through this little slot right here because there's plenty of room for it. You plug in the main power, the 24 pin. Make sure it's locked on there nice and tight. Tuck the rest of the cable out of the way. Now, you take the PCIe power for the board. There's the little slot at the top for it to come through. You bend it the way you need. Snap it on there. And there you go. Also, you can slide the USB 3 header excess cable out of the way. Same for the power switch, reset switch, and other front panel goodies. And same for the front panel audio. Just to tuck them out of the way. Now, we are going to take the modular power supply's cables and start plugging things in, or getting ready to plug things in. Yes, sometimes having a pair of scissors on hand is handy. Now, one thing I will say about this case that I'm not too big a fan of, no pun intended, is that the fans plug in through a 4-pin Molex cable, which is this. Now, the irritating thing that I find is that I only have need for one 4-pin Molex, and I am plugging in an entire strand into the modular power supply to accomplish this. Very frustrating. However, it is what it is. So you go to your 4-pin Molex power strip, power line, whatever, and you plug it into the appropriate slot on the power supply. And in this case, I will be leaving it tie wrapped just because I actually don't want them to be very loose. I like to have a relatively neat case and cabling. You plug in the necessary 4-pin Molex and you're good. Now, that hard drive, solid state drive, it needs power. Not a lot, but again, I have to plug in to the appropriate slot and take these SATA power and plug it in. Run it through the back, and there you go. Now, the video card is also going to require power. So you take these power cables right here. Again, you plug in appropriately to the power supply, and then I will leave these here for the video card. Now, here is the back. And I'm going to plug in the power supply to the drive. The excess cable I'm going to tuck in above it to an unused drive slot. I'm going to tuck the cables away a bit. And now I'm going to grab the data cable for the drive. You plug it in. and you push through into the front, or you can plug it into the motherboard. So you take that little SATA cable and you plug it in. Now these ports are side facing, which makes it a little bit difficult to deal with, but not too bad. You also have this back fan here, which will plug in up here apparently, next to the PCIe power to the board. Once you plug that in, I'm going to route the cable through the back here. Again, just to try to keep things nice and clean on the inside. Now, the power supply, video card, takes up 2 slots here. So we're going to undo the back plates for the expansion cards, 2 of them to be exact, that line up with the first PCI Express slot for the video card. Now, as far as installing the video card goes, very simple. You line up the PCI slot with the card, and you make sure that the backplate to the video card doesn't get stuck. You push in, and you screw back in to where you undid the backplates to hold the video card nicely in place. You take the power that we set up earlier for the video card. You find the plug that it needs, and you push it into the slot. And done! Your computer is built. It should turn on, fire up, all that wonderful good stuff. For argument's sake, I will be sliding on the covers. Once the cover is slid on, just line up the thumb screw and screw in. Turn it around. Pop on the other side cover. Screw in and done! Your machine is ready to be plugged in, turned on, and set up with whatever operating system you choose. Should be Windows. Gamers unite.